Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. My name is Jeremy Seitz. I'm a pediatrician and pediatric critical care fellow at the University of North Carolina, and I'm also in the Master's in Health Professions Education program at NC State University. This is a project for Module 5 of one of my NC State University courses, EAC 595, International and Comparative Adult Education. The topic of this submission will be on medical education, taking a global perspective at medical education around the world. The title of this presentation is Medical Education Around the World, Comparing Japan and the United States. Why did we choose this particular topic? Well, for this international and comparative adult education course, the focus of most of my assignments have been centered on medical education, the undergraduate medical education system, which most of us know of as medical school, and then the postgraduate medical education system, which is more commonly known as residency and fellowship training. And so thinking about that, I wanted to focus this project on the medical education system of another country in relation to the United States. What you've run up against in doing these global comparative education projects are language barriers, and so if interested in delving into a specific adult education realm like medical education for a non-English speaking country, it can be very difficult. Originally I thought about choosing a country like France, Germany, Spain to center this project on, and I just found that there really wasn't enough in the English language on their medical education systems for me to do a proper presentation. So I started to think a little bit more about it. I have this hobby or obsession of distance running, and so a lot of the things that I read about center on distance running. There's this particular author that I really like, Ed Harn-Enfind, and I recently came across one of his books on tape called The Way of the Runner, and it centers on his story going to Japan and learning the ins and outs of the Japanese distance running community. And so that sort of popped into mind, and I thought I would look into the medical education system that Japan has in place. And so that was sort of the basis for this presentation. Again, some other countries were considered, but unless there's a significant influence by an English-speaking country, which we will get to with Japan, or the country itself is English-speaking, then it can be pretty difficult to find adequate information on adult education systems in non-English-speaking countries. But I'm glad I've thought of this, and I'm glad that I learned more about the Japanese medical education system. Hopefully you find it interesting as well. The materials and emphasis for the rest of the presentation really stem from this journal submission that you see a screenshot of here, an article titled "History of Japanese Medical Education" by Dr. Anishi, published in the Korean Journal of Medical Education, and I believe this was in the 2010s. The paper is a great review of the history of the Japanese medical education system, really going all the way as far back as the 1860s and on. It goes through the progression and evolution in different phases, and we'll talk about those phases. There's sort of this spin, because this is published in a Korean journal, on the Japanese influence on Korean medical education. We won't really talk too much about that. I really want to just stick to the Japanese medical education system. But we'll talk about Japanese imperialism and how it influenced other countries in East Asia. We'll talk about that a little bit. One thing I like to do when I do sort of a journal club style presentation is give just a little bit of biographical information on the author, because I think it sort of helps you understand the context and potential expertise of the author, potential biases maybe of the author. And so who is Dr. Anishi? He is a lecturer and researcher at the Graduate School of Medicine at the University of Tokyo. University of Tokyo, which we'll talk about, is one of the oldest medical schools in Japan. Dr. Anishi is a pretty prolific researcher. His emphasis is on medical education, assessment, program evaluation, clinical education, and clinical reasoning. So really, this paper is right up his alley. I think he does a terrific job of giving us a thorough but concise summary of the Japanese medical education system. So yeah, with that introduction, let's jump into it. One thing Dr. Anishi talks about early on in the paper is the influence of Confucianism in Japanese and Korean medical education, and how culture plays a big role in the medical education system in any country around the world, and then specific to Japan and Korea, Confucianism. I thought that was interesting. He touched on it very early in one of the opening paragraphs, and then really goes on to talk more about the influence that some European countries and the USA play on Japan later. And so there was a bit of a disconnect. I didn't really kind of see the tie-in as the paper went on with Confucianism and Japanese medical education. He talks a little bit about complementary medicine, alternative medicine, the more traditional style medicine, and how there's this divorce early on in the evolution of the Japanese medical education system. And I wonder if Confucianism maybe played more of a role in those alternative medical therapies. But in any sense, he introduces this idea, so I wanted to at least mention it briefly. So what is Confucianism? A lot of us are probably somewhat vaguely familiar with this idea, but it's an ancient Chinese belief system that really has a large hand in the cultural system throughout East Asia. It focuses on the importance of personal ethics and morality. There's this debate about Confucianism as more of a moral philosophy versus a religion. I think that's probably a bit unsettled in terms of that debate, but best understood as an ethical guide to living life with strong moral character. One of the main ideas in Confucianism is this idea of, quote, cosmic harmony, in which having good moral character has this positive impact on the world around you, and poor moral character may bring consequences. So the National Geographic article that I drew from to give me a little bit more background in Confucianism talked about a couple of examples. So the emperor who had a strong moral underpinning, strove for moral perfection, he would rule over an empire that was peaceful, benevolent, and prosperous, versus the cultural system, perhaps, where there's this low moral character that pervades the people in that system. That type of culture may experience natural disasters, conflict, strife, poverty. And so anyway, that's sort of the underpinning of Confucianism, this idea that moral character is at the center of one's focus, this emphasis on humanity, which breeds virtuous behavior, respect for others, altruism, humility. And then Confucius himself actually believed that a strong foundation in education was key to this strong moral character. So maybe something that sort of helps us understand a little bit better the Japanese culture, knowing that this ancient belief system is something that has heavily influenced their culture today. The next few slides will go over the history of the Japanese medical education system from the 19th century, 20th century, now the 21st century. So this slide will focus on the 19th century. A few major points here that really highlight what this slide is getting at. In the second half of the 19th century, there was really this, I mentioned it in the last slide, this divorce or separation of modern medicine or Western medicine is how Dr. Anishi described it, and more traditional, complementary alternative medicine. And so this really became a distinct practice of medicine that followed more of the European system specifically mentioned in the article were countries like the UK, the Netherlands, and Germany. So that's a big highlight, a big key point to take away from the 19th century. With this came the establishment of medical schools and universities, along with more rigorous and regulated medical licensing standards for Japanese physicians. And so a couple of the institutions that really started to set the stage for the transformation of the Japanese medical education system. A school called the Eastern College was established in the early 1870s. Eastern College, of course, being the translated name. This was the first government-run medical school in Japan. This was established with the help of German medical teachers, German physicians and medical educators. So some of the courses were taught in German. There was obviously a very heavy influence of the German style of medical practice. A few years later, the University of Tokyo, which I mentioned a slide or two ago, was established. It offered kind of a broad array of studies, including medicine, but outside of medicine, it offered studies in law, science, literature. With this, the Japanese and German connection continued as Germany was invited to send some of their faculty to become teachers and professors at the University of Tokyo. And so that kind of continued this emphasis on Western medicine becoming the new standard in Japan. And then in terms of more rigorous standards for physicians, in the same decade, the 1870s, there were several laws and acts passed that required examinations for physicians in order for them to be eligible for practice. This became sort of a nationwide unified system that was regulated by the government. So again, you see this move away from traditional medicine more towards a Western style of medicine. You see the opening of medical schools, typically government-regulated medical schools, and then you see stricter regulations for medical licensure for physicians as well in the 19th century. There were a lot of changes in the 20th century in Japanese medical education, and this short slide unfortunately won't do it justice. But there were a couple of different phases in the 20th century of medical education. There was the pre-war phase. There was the immediate post-war phase from about the 1940s to the 1980s. And then 1990s on, in Japan, there are a lot of changes that really sort of bleed in and overlap with the 21st century. So we'll talk about that more in the next slide. So let's focus on the first two bullet points for the sake of this slide. Pre-war, there's this concern in Japan that there aren't enough rural physicians in outlying villages. The system tied to colleges and university is maybe sort of elitist. The physicians that stay or that graduate from these medical institutions tend to stay, and they aren't fulfilling the needs of the outlying rural communities. And so these medical vocational schools open to service that need. So really a larger number of medical schools, larger number of enrollees and medical students. There's this growth in the medical education system during this time. And then Japan was really at the height of its imperialist era during this period of time. And so you see Japan's heavy influence in some other East Asian countries and territories, a heavy influence in countries like Taiwan, Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar. They're now, I guess at the time known as Burma, but now known as Myanmar. And then some other territories, Manchuria and Kwantung are mentioned as well. So really broad, sweeping influence throughout East Asia during this imperialist era. Post-war, as we know, Japan really suffered. They suffered a major setback. They had started to become a major world leader in a lot of ways, economically and in the sciences and engineering. that really comes to a halt after World War II. They are really at a low point. The United States steps in and helps restructure, not just in the medical education system, but in a lot of ways. Specific to the medical education system, there's specific mention of one gentleman, a physician named Dr. Sams. He was a brigadier general in the U.S. Army Medical Corps. He was tasked with sort of leading this restructuring of the Japanese medical education system. So he went in and made a lot of changes that resonated and really set the stage for the modern Japanese medical education system that we'll talk more about in the next slide. He really focused on closing some of these medical vocational schools that really weren't up to standard. He focused on improving the medical school educational system, reinstating the National Medical License Examination, and implementing a clinical practice training system for medical students in Japan. At this time, there was, while they were going through a lot of these changes in the 1940s and 1950s, a lot of medical schools are closing, enrollment is down. There's a lull in the Japanese medical training system, a number of physicians that are being produced. But as they sort of get back on their feet in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, there's sort of this renewal, this resurgence, and more medical schools are opening and more physicians are being trained once again. And we see that this is in large part due to the U.S. influence on the Japanese medical education system. So there are a number of changes that take place in the 1990s and onward that really changed the face of the Japanese medical education system. Late in the 90s, there was an advisory panel that met that really wanted to focus on more of the abstract skills of the medical student, so that in their clinical practice, once graduated to the role of a physician, they had this broader skill set that expanded just beyond just clinical knowledge or procedural skills. So they really wanted to emphasize humanism in medicine, or the approach to the patient, with empathy, with care and kindness, making the patient the center of your care. An emphasis on the perspective of lifelong learning, that medical education doesn't end when you graduate medical school or finish training, but you really need to continue to learn and grow throughout your medical practice. And then participation and understanding, recognition of the global medical community, using a global perspective to guide your practice. So what are other countries doing when treating a specific disease process? What's the evidence? What are the guidelines? And how can I use that to guide my practice? The next thing that changed was a restructuring of the preclinical curriculum, development of the model core curriculum, as it was called. The major medical schools in Japan all met. They all had representatives that met, and through consensus decided that they needed to restructure their preclinical years so that certain medical knowledge and competencies were met and taught, so that no matter what medical school a student was attending in Japan, they were getting a similar experience that was well grounded and high yield for their medical practice. And so through the model core curriculum that was implemented, students had to demonstrate certain competencies that were tested on the Common Achievement Test, as well as the objective structured clinical examination. And this was something that all Japanese medical students, before entering the clinical phase of their training, would have to pass in order to move on. And then finally, there was a change in the postgraduate training. There was implementation of a 2-year mandatory general training in which immediately upon graduation from medical school, these trainees would have to go through training in various types of medicine: emergency medicine, surgery, pediatrics, obstetrics, and gynecology, a number of broad fields before entering a specialty like pediatrics or surgery or one of the other specialties. And so really three major changes here, and really changed the face of the Japanese medical education system and what that meant for the medical student as well as the medical trainee. So now that we understand a little bit more of the Japanese medical education system from a historical perspective, let's step back and compare the United States and Japan. And what we'll find really is that there are a lot of similarities between the two, which, again, going back to Japan's history isn't surprising, as the United States had a significant influence in the second half of the 20th century. So let's look at a few points here. The medical school system, or the undergraduate medical education system, as we talked about earlier, those are synonymous terms. In the United States, it's regulated by a specific entity known as the ACGME, the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education. And this really just goes in and makes sure that medical schools are meeting certain standards. And if they're not, those medical schools can actually lose accreditation. In Japan, they have a very similar system in place, and indeed their regulating body has a very similar name. Medical schools are regulated by the Japan Accreditation Council for Medical Education. So pretty similar systems in place to regulate the medical school education. Point number two, there's a significant European influence in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries in the United States. There was a major shift in medical education in the United States during that time. A lot of it had to do with the Flexner Report, as well as the opening of the Johns Hopkins University. It really made the practice of medicine much more science and research focused, whereas before there really was a lack of foundational science education in medical schools prior to this time period, and that really came out of heavy influence from European medical schools and hospital systems. Indeed, a lot of United States medical school graduates during that time period would go over to Europe and learn from clinical experts and researchers at various hospitals and universities, all over Western Europe. Similar system in place, like we talked about in Japan. Heavy German influence specifically, but Great Britain and the Netherlands were also talked about as big influencers in the Japanese medical education system during that same time period. In terms of what medical school entails, the time investment for the medical student in the United States, there's some variability in this, but mostly the expectation is that the student will have completed 4 years of general education at a college or university, and then from there will complete 4 years of medical school before entering postgraduate training. In Japan, this is a bit different. They typically will enter medical school immediately after high school graduation. They enter a 6-year program. The first 4 years of that are emphasizing preclinical education, and then the final 2 years emphasizing clinical education in the hospital, the clinic, the operating room, hands-on patient care those last 2 years. There are expectations that medical students in the United States pass a series of exams and prove certain competencies, similar to what we talked about with Japan in the last slide. We have a examinations series called the USMLE, Steps 1, 2, and 3, United States Medical Licensing Exam. And you take these in medical school and then the first year of residency training in order to qualify as a licensed physician. And then along the way in medical schools are expected to test your patient care, clinical competencies through the OSCE. We talked about that with Japan. They have a similar although a bit different of a name. They have the CAT, and then they also have an OSCE, similar to the U.S. And then finally, postgraduate training. How does that differ in the U.S. and Japan? There is a bit of a difference here. This may be the biggest difference on this slide. Postgraduate training in the U.S. is typically 3 to 5 years, almost always minimum of 3 years for general specialties like family medicine, internal medicine, pediatrics, and it may go as long as 7 or 8 years in a specialty like neurosurgery, but typically on average 3 to 5 years in order to complete residency training and qualify to sit for your boards and be an independent practicing physician. In Japan, we talked about the changes in the 21st century that regulated 2 years of general medical training, where you do much more than just your specialty. Perhaps you're interested in pediatrics. During those 2 years, you would have to rotate not only in pediatrics, but in adult medicine and the operating room and obstetrics and gynecology, specialties like that, beyond just your specialty interest. And then after completing that, you move on to your specific specialty and get additional training. And that's less regulated. That's less uniform. There's more variability in that than there is in the United States system. So as we wrap up this presentation, let's talk about a few final thoughts and summarize what we've talked about in the last several slides. My big takeaway from this presentation really is that the medical education systems in the United States and Japan overall are pretty similar. I think that was my biggest surprise. But after learning more, it makes sense. In the late 19th century, there's really this shift that Europe led to create a more Western style of medicine that was much more founded in biomedical sciences, that called for much more rigorous schooling and training for the physician that really just did not exist prior to that. And so that European influence really impacted the United States and Japan. And then, of course, post-World War II, the United States just had a heavy hand in a lot of areas of education and economic development in Japan, and that included the medical education system. So that becomes less of a surprise as well as to why the two look so similar. And then finally, in terms of thinking about Japan, I think it can be thought about in various phases. Really sort of breaks it down in a simple way. There was the pre-war phase, that divorce of traditional medicine and the adoption of Western style medicine. And then this initial growth in the medical education offerings in Japan as well as outside of Japan, and the territories and countries that Japan had authority over during their imperialist phase. And then the next phase, as we mentioned, the post-war phase, the heavy U.S. influence. And then the 1990s on, there were several changes made that changed the emphasis of medical education, hoping to make the medical student much more broad in their skill set. It led to changes in the way medical students were tested and the expectations of the medical student. It became much more uniform across Japan. And then finally, the medical training of the Japanese medical school graduate changed as well. There was this mandatory 2 years of general training that was implemented before one could enter a specialty. So I think that summarizes it. Those are my final thoughts and takeaways from this presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please let me know if you have any questions or feedback about the presentation. Again, thanks for listening.